Talk with the Experts. Welcome to Talk with the Experts, the new podcast by the Italian Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam, designed to dive deep into key topics shaping Vietnam's role in today's global affairs. In each episode, we'll hear from leading experts as they share insights, perspectives, and analysis on the challenges and opportunities facing businesses and professionals with interests in Vietnam. We're kicking off this new series with a special episode featuring Professor Claudio Dordi, a scholar of international law and an expert in trade relations between Italy and Vietnam. Together, we'll explore the U.S. tariff policy and its potential impact on trade and investment in Vietnam, with a focus on a potential agreement between the United States and Vietnam, which has not yet been officially concluded or disclosed based on currently available information. Stay tuned as we unpack complex global dynamics with those who know them best. Enjoy the episode.
In this episode, we will analyze the main measures implemented by President Trump since the beginning of his second term, his objectives, and the current state of international trade relations between the United States and its trading partners, with particular attention to Vietnam. Since the beginning of the second term, the administration of the United States has increased tariffs on a number of imported products. Three are the main objectives targeted by the US. First, reducing trade deficit. Secondly, encouraging the strengthening of domestic manufacturing in the US. In practice, bringing back manufacturing production in the US. And third, cutting the national debt. We know that the United States began raising import tariffs during first Trump presidential term. While China was the main target at that moment, the US also imposed additional tariffs on products like aluminum and steel. Biden, in its mandate, then largely maintained this policy, but the outcomes fell short of expectations. It is true that the trade deficit with China decreased by 21% from 2017, start of the Trump's term, to 2024, end of Biden's term. However, the overall trade deficit grew from just under 600 billion US dollar to around 1 trillion. Manufacturing jobs in the US rose only modestly, testifying a limited reshoring of the US activities, and the national debt more than doubled between 2017 and 2024. The new Trump's trade policy since January can be identified in three different distinct periods. First, from the beginning of his second term to April 2nd, from April 3rd to July 9, and after July 9. First, from the start of the second mandate to April 1st, 2025. During the initial months of Trump's second term, the administration resumed its aggressive trade agenda. Tariffs were reimposed or increased on key strategic sectors such as steel and aluminum. The tariffs were raised for these two products to 25%, and tariffs on cars were applied at rates of 25%, and in some cases 50%. The administration justified these measures as necessary to protect US manufacturing and national security, in particular those related to the defense sector. From April 2nd to July 9, we had important innovation. Well, on April 2nd, known as a so-called Liberation Day, President Trump signed an executive order launching a new tariff regime. For example, a 10% universal baseline tariff was introduced on all imports from all countries. A planned reciprocal tariffs range from 11 to 50%, depending on the trading partner was threatened to be imposed. In the case of Vietnam, the US announced a punitive tariff of 46% on Vietnamese export to the US. These measures, like those implemented previously, were inconsistent with WTO obligations. WTO is the main institutions regulating international trade. And they were illegal because they contradicted two important principles of the World Trade Organization. First, the non-discrimination principle, and second, the tariff binding commitments that each state accepted when they become members of the WTO. However, on April 9, Trump suspended the implementation of these reciprocal tariffs for 90 days, maintaining, however, the 10% general tariffs on all import. This suspension was scheduled to expire on July 9. Interesting to know that during this suspension period, tariffs on aluminum and cars followed a different track, remaining substantially higher, up to 50%. And the US in this period started bilateral negotiations with key trading partners using the executive order of April 2nd as a leverage tool to pressure trading partners into reducing their own tariffs on US export. The third phase we can consider starting after July 9. As the conclusion of trade agreements had been slow, the US escalated its efforts by sending formal letters to trading partners warning that failure to reach deals would result in very high tariffs. For instance, in a letter to Japan, the US threatened to impose a 35% tariff on Japanese exports if no agreement was reached. This forced many developed and developing countries into rapid negotiations and new bilateral trade deals. Indeed, key agreements concluded in this period included an agreement with China. We remember that initially China was subject to an extreme tariff escalation. At the beginning, the US tariff applied to China reached 145%, with a retaliatory measure applied by China equal to 125%. The deals reached with China implied an import tariff for the United States of 30% on Chinese goods, while China imposed a 10% tariff on US imports. Additionally, China agreed to ease export restrictions on rare earth materials, those materials which are considered very important for US tech manufacturing. Again, we experienced an agreement with the United Kingdom, where the US, according to the agreement, US applied a 10% tariff on UK goods, and in parallel, the United Kingdom agreed to liberalize access to specific US exports. For example, certain meats under a tariff rate quotas. Indonesia and Philippines reached an agreement through which the United States applied a 19% tariff on import from these two countries, while both nations agreed to remove all tariffs on US products imported in their territory. Recently, Japan concluded an agreement where Japanese tariffs are taxed by the US authorities at 15%, following the initial threat of 35%. And the European Union, in a recent agreement, agreed with the US on the application of 15% of general tariff for EU originating products exported to the US. Other details come soon about this project. Summarizing, we can classify the US bilateral agreements in two different groups. First, agreements with developed countries, especially with UK, Japan, and also China. In these agreements, the US applied moderate tariffs, while these countries maintained some tariffs on goods exported from the United States, but opened specific sectors of interest of US. With developing countries, for example, Indonesia and Philippines, the US applied higher tariffs, 19%, but these countries agreed to fully liberalize their imports from the United States. Let's now turn to the situation in Vietnam. A preliminary agreement between the United States and Vietnam, announced on July 2nd by President Trump, sets a 20% tariff on Vietnamese export to the US, which increases to 40% if those products are determined to result from transshipment of goods primarily manufactured in China. What does this mean? Well, to understand the implications, we need first to distinguish between legal and illegal transshipment. Legal transshipment can involve relocation of production activities from China to Vietnam, where manufacturing is generally carried out in Vietnam and not merely a means to circumvent US tariffs on Chinese goods. By contrast, illegal transshipment refers to superficial processing or minimal assembly in Vietnam that does not meet the requirement to confer Vietnamese origin, but it is used to disguise Chinese origin. Determining whether a product qualifies as Vietnamese in origin for US customs purposes depends on the application of the so-called rules of origin, which assign a product's nationality. Traditionally, the United States, like most countries, applies the principle of last substantial transformation. In practice, a product is considered to originate from the country where the last significant manufacturing process took place. In applying the traditional rules of origin, if the manufacturing conducted in Vietnam is deemed substantial, meaning that it results in a new product or represents a significant stage of production, then the product is considered to be Vietnamese and therefore subject to a 20% tariff according to the new agreement. However, if the production in Vietnam is insufficient, for example, is just simple assembly or packaging of Chinese component, the product will be treated as Chinese in origin and taxed at a higher 40% rate. The situation looks quite simple. However, pending negotiations, there are two main important issues to consider. First, the interpretation and application of the substantial transformation principle by US authorities. We need to know that in the US legal system, based on common law, these determinations often depend on a case by case assessment and past court interpretations. This raises uncertainty. And the question that we need to raise to ourselves is, will the US continue applying the same interpretative standards of substantial transformation to Vietnamese imports? Secondly, will the US apply specific rules of origin to imports from Vietnam, such as requiring a minimum level of value added in Vietnam to qualify as Vietnamese origin? This new threshold will be introduced as a result of the pending negotiating new agreement with Vietnam. If such a threshold is introduced, it could significantly shape the future of US Vietnam's trade relations. What conclusions can we draw from the current situation? Well, three main conclusions. First, the 20% tariff on Vietnamese export to the US may not hit as hard as expected. What really matters is how it compares to tariffs on goods from other countries competing with Vietnam in the US market. For example, Indonesia and the Philippines secured a slightly lower rate, 19%, which give us a useful benchmark and give us an encouraging situation. Secondly, companies producing in Vietnam need to rethink where they get their parts and materials. With US China tensions still high, relying too much on Chinese inputs is risky, not just for export to the US, but also to Europe and other markets where similar origin rules could apply in the future. Third, given recent political instability and sudden policy changes in the US, nothing is guaranteed. Trade deals can be changed or cancelled overnight. Exporters and governments need to stay flexible and ready to adapt. In the next episode, we will focus our attention on the content of US Vietnam agreement now being negotiated. We will look on how rules of origin might apply, especially how much Chinese content will be allowed, and what makes a product officially Vietnamese under US trade rules.